How the Light Gets In is the Institute of Art and Ideas' unique festival, combining days full of talks and debates in philosophy, politics, arts and science, with evenings full of music and dance. Get your tickets for the world's largest music and philosophy festival at howthelightgetsin.org.
I was wondering whether you might want to talk about quite a sensitive subject that you've been covering recently, and that's the Skripal case.
Oh, yes.
You've made various statements at different points based on how much information was
Sure.
available to you, and I was wondering whether, if looking back at what you've thought so far, have you changed your mind about anything? What is your position?
On the contrary, everything I now know buttresses the points that I've been making throughout, which is essentially that there's very much more to this than meets the eye, or perhaps very much less to this than meets the eye would be a better way of putting it. My current thinking on the Skripal case is that it can be compared to a drug deal gone wrong. I'm perfectly sure that these two Russians that were identified by the police are involved in the case. I don't believe for 1 minute, and never have, that they came to see Salisbury Cathedral and Stonehenge, but were put off by the slush. I never believed that for a second. So I'm perfectly sure that these two Russians were in contact either with the Skripals or with people who were in contact with the Skripals. I think they came to Salisbury for that purpose. But I don't believe for a minute that they are Russian intelligence agents. If they are, then God help the Russian people if that's the caliber of Russian intelligence these days. We're asked to believe that these two men were banging prostitutes and smoking drugs in a flea pit hotel in East London the night before an assassination attempt, leaving Novichok in their hotel room, but so scarcely that the police didn't even tell the hotelier, never mind the staff and the guests that have been staying there ever since the police knew on May the 7th that there were traces of what they're calling Novichok in that hotel. We're asked to believe that two people under their own names flew directly to and from Moscow and made no attempt to cover their identities, indeed seemed to be seeking out CCTV cameras to grin at in a comedy parade of how not to do intelligence work. So I absolutely do not believe that these two people are Russian intelligence agents, and I do not believe that the Russian state had any motive at all for carrying out such a crime at that time.
So who do you think had an interest in this? And if they're not from the Russian intelligence services, where are they coming from?
Well, it could be anything. They could be working for other intelligence services, but it's much more likely that they're involved in some criminal activity. I believe they were criminals, and I believe the secret of this whole case lies in the undergrowth of Russian oligarch, the overlap between Russian oligarch politics and crime.
So is your argument that this is not about the Russian intelligence getting involved in this, just purely the fact that you think the Russian intelligence services should be a lot smarter?
No, not at all. My principal reason for not believing it is the old legal adage, cui bono, who benefits? Who benefited from this crime at that time, 100 days exactly before the beginning of the World Cup, into which Russia had invested billions and risked the entire public relations of the World Cup. A few days before Putin's presidential election, and when Russia was already facing a raft of international sanctions and ostracism, it simply doesn't benefit Russia to carry out such a crime at that time.
But doesn't that mean that you see states as being quite rational agents
Well, you know, you can't have it both ways. The West paints Putin as a Mephistopheles, a wizard, a grand wizard, burgling the elections in the United States, rigging Brexit, trying to rig the Scottish referendum, rigging the political situation in Catalonia. You can't have it both ways. You can't say he's Mephistopheles, but he's an idiot. He's either one or the other. He can't be both.
So what do you think Putin is?
A very smart operator, one of the smartest in the world today, 10 times smarter than the American president or the British Prime Minister for that matter. I believe he acts in Russia's interests, and it was not in Russia's interest to carry out the Skripal affair. If the hidden point in your question is, do I support him? No, I don't. If I'd been a Russian, I wouldn't have voted for him. But I do support many of the foreign policy stances that he has taken, particularly in Syria, where he has been instrumental in defeating ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism in the Middle East, which I think is a necessary but not sufficient condition for stability, peace, progress in that area.
So would you say then that the attacks on civilians that Russia has carried are just casualties that any actor in...
Well, the primary responsibility for those actions lies with those who sent and paid for and armed the jihadists to enter these areas, occupy them, torture the people, crucify them literally, cut their heads off, and cut the heads off any journalist who turned up to see what was going on. There is a state of total war in Syria, or there has been, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda have to be defeated. That's the view that Britain and America took in Mosul, in Iraq, which they completely leveled, killing tens of thousands of civilians. It's funny that nobody ever asks me about that. They only ask me about civilian casualties in Syria.
Who would you have voted for in Russia? You said that had you been Russian, you wouldn't have voted.
I would have voted for the candidate of the Communist Party.
Why?
Because I'm a socialist. I believe that Putin's government is far too soft on the rich and powerful in Russia, and does far too little for the broad mass of the people. Putin has lifted living standards in Russia by 1.5 times in his period in office. In other words, everyone in Russia is 150% better off than they were before he came to power. But far too little has been done to redistribute Russia's wealth, especially in the period of a high oil price, which is getting quite high again. And therefore I would have voted for the candidate closest to my political views, and that would have been the Communist Party candidate.
And I have one more question. So you tend to focus a lot on the crimes that America or Britain commit, and you tend to defend Russia. And I'm wondering why you wouldn't criticize all of them.
What crimes has Russia committed?
Invade Crimea?
First of all, Russia didn't invade Crimea. The Crimean people voted overwhelmingly to rejoin Russia, the emphasis being on rejoin, and the international community should recognize that, and they will, and before not very much longer also. So I don't regard that as a crime. If you've got any other examples, give me one.
Do you think that holding a referendum when the army is around you is a fair condition for a referendum?
The government, the legitimate government of the Ukraine was overthrown by force. Western coordinated, financed, organized force. The parliament was set on fire, the president was chased from the country, and the first act of the coup authorities in Kiev was to delegitimize the language of 40% of the country, namely the Russian language. The Ukraine has set upon a course of civil war against the provinces which are Russian-speaking, culturally Russian, in some cases actual Russian nationals. And the responsibility for the situation in the Ukraine lies with the coup authorities in Kiev and their fascist base, literally fascist. I mean, people who literally worship fascist collaborators who murdered, massacred Jews in the Ukraine even before the SS arrived. So I'm sorry if you expect me to have any sympathy with the coup authorities in Kiev. I simply don't.
George, I have a question. So I'm Moldovan. I've always been on the side of the victims of Russia. And I wonder whether you see any similarity, you know, in the way that, for instance, when Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia declared more pro-Western European intentions, suddenly, you know, Russia put a ban on Moldovan and Georgian wine, on fruit coming from Moldova and Georgia. Do you not see a similarity in the way it acted in the after the Maidan protests then with Ukraine, or you know, when Georgia was becoming more kind of pro-Western, Russia invaded Georgia.
Well, I already...
Side with the victims at all?
That's a rather tendentious way of putting it. I already worked out where you were coming from by your second question, and now at least you're being frank and open. The short answer to your question is no. Russia's entitled to stop importing Georgian wine, just like Georgia's entitled to stop importing Russian goods, and both have done so. So I simply don't accept your premise. I don't believe that Russia is a malign actor in Georgia. I believe that Georgian nationalism, fanaticism, is the malign actor there. I'm not a nationalist, and however sweet your entreaties, you'll never entice me there.
So would you say then, for instance, in the case of, you know, India and Britain, for instance, you would always condemn any kind of national independence kind of movement?
No, national independence is one thing. Chauvinism, xenophobia is quite another. And Ukrainian nationalism, and Georgian nationalism for that matter, are xenophobic, chauvinistic, anti-Russian. You mustn't define your nationalism with reference to other people. That's why I'm against Scottish nationalism, for example, because it is essentially defining Scotland by a dislike of England. And this happens when small countries are next to big countries. No, I'm just not with you on your premise.
So do you then not side with Russian nationalist
No.
kind of discourses either?
No.
So then what would you say?
My flag is red, and it's a worldwide flag. I don't support any nationalism anywhere.
But then you said that you do support Putin's foreign policies.
Yeah. In Syria to defeat Islamist fundamentalism, yeah.
And also you...
That has nothing to do with nationalism.
And also you...
That's internationalism.
But you also support Russia's annexation of Crimea, which came with a
It
lot
came in the
nationalist
wake
discourse.
of xenophobic, chauvinistic, and at least partly fascistic coup in Kiev. The people in eastern Ukraine and the people in Crimea are not going to live under a Ukrainian xenophobic government with a fascist base on the streets. They're just not going to, and they didn't, and they haven't, and they never will.
But do you not agree, so on this side with like the fascist, you know, parts of the Maidan protests, do you not think that, you know, in any massive movement you are going to get a kind of tiny part?
Oh, it's very far from tiny. The fascist militarized base of Ukrainian nationalism is well charted, as is their anti-Semitism, as is their blatant racism. So you'll find no sympathy from me for that, I'm afraid. No matter how many times you ask the same question.
And you don't think that these kind of fascist ideas ideas are, or imperialist ideas are promoted by the Russian government at all at the moment?
As I say, I don't know how many times you're going to ask the same question, but I'm as patient as you are, and the answer is no. Thank you very much.
Get your tickets for the world's largest music and philosophy festival at howthelightgetsin.org.